Hey guys, tonight we're tiptoeing into a world that everyone thinks they understand and almost nobody actually does. Victorian England. You picture it, don't you? Gentle candlelight, ladies in enormous dresses sipping tea with their pinkies raised, gentlemen in top hats bowing politely, and a fog so charming it practically smells of lavender. Tonight we're going to gently, lovingly, and very thoroughly ruin that image for you. Because almost everything you think you know about the Victorians is a lie, a myth, or a rumour that somehow survived longer than most Victorians did. Before we begin, a sincere thank you to the lovely viewer who suggested tonight's topic. Your ideas are the reason this strange little channel keeps growing, and I never take that for granted. If you enjoy what I do here, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually want to. No pressure at all. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because somehow it is always the middle of the night somewhere, and if you would rather drift off with your eyes closed, the channel is now on Spotify too, with the link waiting for you down in the description. And if you'd like a little more, membership is already available on the channel, which gives you access to 8 hours of ad-free video to drift off to, uninterrupted, whenever you like. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft background hum, fluff your pillow, and settle in. Let us wonder together for a moment. Were the Victorians really so proper that they covered up their table legs out of pure modesty? Did they truly drink tea all day, or were they quietly sipping something far more alarming? Was the famous London fog romantic, or was it slowly trying to murder everyone who breathed it? Did they actually love their children, or just love putting them to work? And how exactly did an entire society convince the future that it was elegant, clean, and respectable, while wallpapering its nurseries with poison? Well, congratulations. You have just woken up in 1860, in the beating heart of the greatest empire on earth, wrapped in a world that looks nothing like the postcard. Try not to touch the wallpaper. Let us begin with the biggest lie of them all, the one you've been fed since childhood, that the Victorians were so painfully modest they draped little skirts over their table legs so no one would be scandalised by the sight of furniture. It is a wonderful story. It is also almost entirely nonsense, a tall tale that mostly began as a joke at the expense of prudish visitors and somehow got pinned on an entire century. Nobody was tucking their tables into tiny trousers to protect the virtue of the dinner guests. Behind those buttoned collars and lace curtains lived some of the most enthusiastically filthy minds in European history. Take a stroll down Holywell Street in London, a narrow, crooked lane not far from the respectable shops, and you would find window after window stuffed with pornography, erotic prints, and books so blue they practically glowed. This was not some secret whispered in back rooms. It was a thriving trade, printed, bound, and sold to gentlemen who spent their daylight hours pretending to be shocked by ankles. There were entire underground magazines devoted to the sort of content that would make a modern browsing history look tame. Wealthy collectors amassed private libraries of it. Poems, pamphlets, and photographs circulated freely among the very same men who lectured the poor about decency and self-control. The Victorian gentleman was a champion of public virtue and private hypocrisy, and he practised both with equal dedication. And then there was prostitution, existing on a scale that would horrify the polite fiction of the age. London alone was thought to have tens of thousands of women working the trade, a figure so large that the same society clutching its pearls in the drawing room was quietly keeping half the city in business after dark. Respectability, it turns out, was a coat you wore in the parlour and hung by the door on your way out. So where did the myth of the blushing table-covering prude come from? Partly from the Victorians themselves, who were experts at performing modesty. They genuinely did have strict rules about behaviour in public, elaborate codes about what could be said, worn, and shown in company. A lady did not discuss certain topics at dinner. A gentleman did not swear in front of the vicar. But rules about public behaviour are not the same as private innocence, and the gap between the two was roughly the size of the empire. Think of it like the modern person who posts inspirational quotes about clean living every morning and orders 3 desserts every night. The Victorians simply had better handwriting. They built a magnificent facade of propriety, all polished manners and downcast eyes, and behind it they got up to precisely the things they claimed to find appalling. The facade was the point. As long as the surface stayed spotless, what happened underneath was nobody's business. It is almost admirable, really, the sheer commitment to the double life. An entire civilization agreed to pretend in unison that it was far more virtuous than it actually was, and then defended that pretense so convincingly that we still believe it more than a century later. They did not cover the table legs to protect our innocence. They covered their own tracks to protect their reputations, and they did it beautifully. So no, they were not too delicate to mention a leg. They were just very, very good at looking the other way. And speaking of things they would rather you did not examine too closely, let us take a nice deep breath and talk about how they actually smelled. Now let us talk about hygiene, because you have been sold a fantasy of powdered ladies and freshly scrubbed gentlemen gliding around in a cloud of lavender water. Take a deep breath in Victorian England and you will immediately regret it, because the air is doing something complicated and the people are not much better. For most of the population, a full bath was a rare and slightly suspicious event. Indoor plumbing was a luxury reserved for the well-off, and even then it arrived slowly and unevenly across the century. Hot water was a genuine ordeal, hauled and heated over a fire in pots and kettles, poured into a tin tub in front of the hearth, and shared, in poorer homes, by the whole family in turn. If you were the last one in, you were bathing in a lukewarm memory of everyone who went before you. Suddenly your modern shower feels like a small miracle, does it not? The wealthy had their scented soaps, their rose water, and their servants to help them stay presentable. Everyone else made do with a basin, a rag, and a hopeful attitude. A quick wipe of the face and hands, a splash at the neck, and off you went into the world, sealed in yesterday and the day before. Clothing was washed even less often, because laundry was back-breaking, all-day labour involving boiling water, harsh soap, and endless scrubbing. So garments were worn and worn and worn again until they developed a personality of their own. And this is before we add the environment, which was doing its very best to defeat anyone who tried to stay clean. The cities ran on horses, thousands of them, each contributing generously to the streets, so the smell of manure was simply the smell of being outside. Coal smoke coated everything in a fine film of soot, settling into your hair, your collar, your lungs, and the walls of your home. Wash your face in the morning and by afternoon you would be gently grey again. Then there were the rivers, used as open drains for waste of every description, so that the waterways which should have offered relief instead added their own rich note to the general perfume. In the poorer districts, several families might share a single privy, an arrangement whose fragrance we will politely leave to your imagination. The result was a city that smelled, at all hours, like a competition nobody wanted to win. People coped the way people always do, by simply getting used to it. When everyone around you carries the same layered aroma of sweat, smoke and street, your nose quietly gives up and stops filing complaints. This mercy is called nose blindness, and it was practically a survival skill. The Victorian who wrinkled a nose at a bad smell was reacting to something truly spectacular, because the baseline was already sky high. There was even a fashionable belief in some circles that too much washing was unhealthy, that scrubbing away the body's natural state left you vulnerable, which was a wonderfully convenient theory for a society that found bathing so difficult. Better to mask than to wash. Hence the perfumes, the pomades, and the little scented handkerchiefs held delicately to the face, all designed not to make you clean but to make you slightly less noticeable. So the powdered, rose-scented Victorian of your imagination was, in reality, a person doing their level best to smell like anything other than themselves, in a city determined to undo their efforts by lunchtime. It was not roses, it was a truce. And if you think the street smelled bad, wait until you look up and see what they were breathing. Ah, the London fog. In your imagination it curls softly around a gas lamp, while a gentleman in a cloak strolls past, and it all looks terribly moody and atmospheric, the perfect backdrop for a mystery or a doomed romance. Let me gently correct you. That was not fog. That was the sky trying to kill you. What rolled through Victorian London was not the gentle mist of a country morning. It was a dense, choking blend of coal smoke, soot and industrial fumes, produced by a city that burned coal for absolutely everything, in every home, every factory and every workshop, all day and all night. When the weather trapped that smoke close to the ground, it mixed with genuine fog into something new and horrible, a thick yellow-green sludge that hung in the streets like a bad decision. They called it a pea super, because it really was that colour and nearly that thick. You could hold out your hand and struggle to see it. You could lose your way on a street you had walked 1,000 times. It slipped under doors and around window frames, filling homes with a haze so that people sat coughing at their own firesides. It stained curtains, blackened the washing hung out to dry, and left a greasy film on every surface it touched, including the inside of your lungs. Getting around in a proper pea super was an adventure in the worst sense. Traffic crawled. People walked into walls, into each other, and occasionally, tragically, into the Thames, stepping off an embankment they simply could not see. Torchbearers did brisk business guiding the lost, and even then you were essentially trusting a stranger with a flame to keep you out of the river. Compared to that, being annoyed at your phone losing signal seems like a rather gentle problem, and the fog did more than inconvenience. On the worst days it settled over the city for hours or days at a time, and the very old, the very young, and anyone with weak lungs paid the price. Breathing that air was like inhaling the exhaust of 1,000,000 chimneys, because that is exactly what it was. Deaths rose whenever the great fogs descended, quietly without drama, filed away as ordinary bad luck. The city had built a slow poison into its own weather, and simply learned to live inside it. The Victorians, to their credit, noticed. They complained about the fog constantly, wrote about it, cursed it, and understood perfectly well that it was filthy and dangerous. What they could not do was stop it, because stopping it would have meant stopping the coal, and the coal was the entire point. The smoke was the smell of industry, of progress, of the greatest economy on earth roaring along. You did not get the empire without the chimneys, and you did not get the chimneys without choking on them. So they romanticised it instead, the way you make peace with something you cannot change. Writers gave it atmosphere. Painters loved the strange glowing light it cast. The fog became a character, mysterious and moody, wrapping the city in intrigue. It made for wonderful stories, and it makes for wonderful stories still, which is exactly why you pictured it as charming in the first place. But a good story is not the same as a good time. Behind the moody glow was a public health disaster that people breathed in with every step, a murderer that never faced a jury. The fog was not setting a romantic scene, it was setting a slow, patient trap. And speaking of things that were quietly bad for you, let us pour ourselves a nice, warm, deeply suspicious cup of tea. You imagine the Victorians as a nation of gentle tea drinkers, pinkies aloft, sipping something wholesome and comforting from delicate china. The reality is a good deal soggier and a good deal drunker than the picture suggests. Before you settle in with your imaginary teacup, you should know what else was in everyone's cup, and it was rarely just tea. Start with the water, because the water was a problem. In the crowded cities, clean drinking water was scarce and genuinely dangerous, drawn from sources that were often contaminated with the same waste those lovely rivers were carrying. Drinking plain water could earn you cholera, typhoid, or a very short future. So people did the sensible thing and drank alcohol instead, which was safer because the brewing killed off the worst of the nasties. Beer at breakfast was not decadence, it was risk management, and so a great many Victorians moved through the day mildly lubricated. Weak beer was a staple for adults, and even children in some households. Gin was cheap and plentiful, and had already earned itself a fearsome reputation, and wine and spirits flowed freely among those who could afford them. The idea of a sober, tea-only population is a bit of wishful thinking. A significant slice of the country was quietly buzzed from morning until night, simply to avoid drinking the water that might otherwise finish them off. Now, about that tea. Even when you did get your hands on an honest cup, there was a fair chance it was not entirely honest. In the rush to profit, unscrupulous sellers stretched their tea with all sorts of creative additions. Used tea leaves were dried out, dyed, and sold again as fresh. Ordinary leaves and hedge clippings were mixed in to bulk up the weight, and the colour that made cheap tea look appealing was sometimes achieved with substances you would never willingly swallow, including compounds that had no business anywhere near a kettle. Food and drink in general were a lawless frontier in the early and middle part of the century, before proper regulations arrived with teeth. If a seller could make a product cheaper and heavier by adding something inedible, there was a strong temptation to do exactly that, and tea, being expensive and popular, was a favourite target. So your comforting cuppa might have been a blend of exhausted leaves, garden trimmings and dye, brewed in questionable water, served with a perfectly straight face. Think of it like ordering a premium coffee today, and receiving something that is 30% coffee, 40% lawn, and 30% food colouring, with a cheerful label promising the finest quality. The Victorians had no easy way of knowing what was really in the packet, and no easy way to test it. They simply trusted, brewed and drank, which is a very optimistic way to live. Over time, reformers and chemists began exposing this widespread trickery, publishing alarming reports on just how adulterated everyday food and drink had become, and slowly the law caught up. But for long stretches of the era, the average person genuinely could not be sure whether their tea was tea, their bread was bread, or their beer was quite what it claimed to be. So the polite tea ceremony you pictured, all restraint and refinement, sat on top of a much messier truth. The Victorians drank to stay alive, drank to stay safely hydrated, and drank tea that was often a small act of faith. The pinky may have been raised, but the standards were not. And if a suspicious cup of tea sounds bad, wait until you meet the people they trusted to make them well again. You might assume that by the middle of the 19th century, with all its inventions and its confidence and its magnificent facial hair, medicine had finally become something you could actually rely on. Bless your optimism, step into a Victorian sick room and prepare to lower your expectations, then lower them again. For a good while, doctors still carried the ghost of much older ideas. Treatments rooted in the notion that illness came from imbalances in the body that could be corrected by draining, purging, or otherwise removing something from you. Bloodletting lingered on well past the point where anyone should have known better, so a person already weakened by illness might be relieved of even more of the blood they rather needed. Feeling faint? Here, let us make you fainter. It was a bold strategy. Then there were the remedies themselves, which frequently contained ingredients that read today like a list of things to keep well away from humans. Mercury was used to treat all manner of conditions despite being enthusiastically toxic. Various tonics and pills contained heavy metals and poisons in doses that were meant to cure but often quietly harmed. The line between medicine and slow poisoning was thin, blurry, and regularly crossed with total confidence. But the true stars of Victorian healthcare were the patent medicines. Those cheerful little bottles sold everywhere, by everyone, promising to cure absolutely everything. Coughs, aches, nerves, tiredness, a bad mood, a bad marriage, whatever ailed you, there was a tonic for it, wrapped in bold claims and a reassuring label. There was just one small catch. These miracle cures were largely unregulated, and nobody was obliged to tell you what was actually inside. And what was inside was often alcohol, opium, morphine, or cocaine, which does explain why so many customers felt so much better so quickly. You did not cure the illness, you simply stopped caring about it for a few glorious hours. A syrup that is essentially spirits and opium will absolutely soothe your cough, your worries, and your sense of the passage of time. It will also, taken faithfully, create a whole new problem, but that was a matter for later, and the label never mentioned it. These remedies were sold by travelling salesmen with wagons and patter, by chemists, and by shops of every kind, backed by glowing testimonials and precisely zero evidence. The seller had a moustache, a confident manner, and a financial interest in your belief. You had a fever and a coin. It was a match made in commercial heaven and medical nowhere. Now, to be fair, the Victorian era was also a time of genuine and enormous medical progress. This was the century that began to understand germs, that developed anaesthesia so that surgery no longer meant screaming, that laid the foundations of the hospitals and public health we rely on today. Brilliant minds were dragging medicine, kicking and bleeding into the modern world. The trouble was that these advances arrived unevenly, argued over and resisted, while the mercury pills and the miracle tonics carried on selling briskly right alongside them. So the experience of being sick depended heavily on who you happened to consult and when. You might meet a careful, forward-thinking physician. You might meet a man draining your blood into a bowl. You might simply buy a bottle of something delightful and drift pleasantly toward either recovery or ruin. It was a gamble, and the house, as ever, usually won. If surviving the illness was hard, surviving the cure was its own achievement. And if you think adults had it rough, spare a thought for the smallest Victorians who are about to have the worst childhood imaginable handed to them and called perfectly normal. Here is a comforting picture you should probably let go of before we continue. The Victorian child, rosy-cheeked and adored, playing gently with a wooden hoop in a sunlit nursery while a kindly nanny looks on. Some children truly lived like that. Millions upon millions did not, and their reality would make that nursery scene feel like a cruel joke. For the working poor, children were not a protected treasure to be shielded from the world. They were extra hands, and the family needed every hand it had. So as soon as a child was old enough to be useful, which was alarmingly young, off to work they went. Not to a gentle apprenticeship, but into the mines, the mills, the factories, and the chimneys of the busiest industrial nation on earth. Consider the chimney sweeps. Small boys sent scrambling up narrow, soot-choked flues because their little bodies fit where a grown man's never could. They climbed in the dark, scraping their knees and elbows raw, breathing soot until it settled permanently into their lungs, and every so often a boy became stuck, or worse. It was dangerous, filthy, lung-destroying work, handed to children precisely because they were small enough to do it. Think about that the next time you complain about taking out the bins. Down in the mines, children hauled coal and sat opening and closing ventilation doors in total darkness for hours on end, working shifts long enough to break an adult. In the textile mills, they darted beneath thundering machinery to clear jams and gather scraps, their quick little hands prized and their fingers frequently at risk. The machines did not slow down for children. The machines did not slow down for anyone. The hours were staggering, often stretching to 12 or more in a single day, 6 days a week, in conditions that were loud, dangerous, and exhausting. There was no school for most of these children, no time to play, no expectation of anything softer. Childhood, in the sense we mean today, a protected stretch of years set aside for growing and learning and being small, was largely a privilege of the comfortable classes. For everyone else, being a child simply meant you were a cheaper worker who fit into smaller spaces. And they were cheaper, which was rather the point. Employers could pay children a fraction of an adult's wage, so the temptation to fill a workforce with them was enormous. A family scraping to survive needed those extra coins, and so the whole grim arrangement rolled on, generation after generation, everyone trapped inside a system that treated the young as tiny, disposable machinery. Slowly, over the course of the century, this began to change. Reformers were horrified, wrote about it, campaigned against it, and pushed through laws that gradually limited how young a child could be put to work and how long they could be worked. A string of factory acts and education acts chipped away at the worst of it, and the idea took root at last that children might deserve protection and schooling rather than a shift underground. Progress was real, but it was slow and resisted every step by those profiting from small hands. So when you picture the cherished Victorian child, remember that for a vast number of them, cherished is exactly the wrong word. They were loved by their families, no doubt, in the fierce way of people with nothing to spare, but the world at large regarded them as useful, cheap, and replaceable. The sunlit nursery existed. It just had a very short guest list. And speaking of things the Victorians would rather you did not look at too closely, let us step outside that nursery window and consider the state of the streets below. Picture the Victorian street, and you probably imagine tidy cobblestones, well-dressed crowds moving with purpose, and a general air of civilized bustle, the whole scene lit by a handsome gas lamp. It is a lovely image. Now let us add the horses, and watch that image slowly sink into the mud. The Victorian city ran on horsepower in the most literal sense. Everything moved by horse, the carriages, the cabs, the carts, the omnibuses, the delivery wagons, the whole churning machinery of commerce and travel. That meant tens of thousands of horses filling the streets of a large city on any given day, and every one of those horses was, shall we say, generously productive. The mathematics of this are genuinely staggering, and the results were everywhere underfoot. The streets were coated in manure mixed with mud, rainwater, and whatever else the city shed onto its own surface, churned by countless wheels and boots into a thick, sucking paste. In dry weather it baked and crumbled into a fine, foul dust that blew into your face and settled on your food. In wet weather it became a slick brown soup that splashed up your legs and ruined your hem before you had gone 100 paces. There was no winning. There was only choosing your preferred texture of filth. This is where the crossing sweepers came in, and they tell you everything about how bad it was. These were people, very often children, who stationed themselves at street corners with a broom and swept a clear path through the muck, so that a respectable person could cross without wading through it. In exchange, they hoped for a coin. An entire small profession existed for the sole purpose of clearing a walkable line across the road, because otherwise crossing the street meant destroying your clothes and possibly your dignity. Imagine needing to tip a stranger just to reach the other side of the road without incident. And the mess was not only from horses. The same streets carried the overflow of a city with inadequate drainage, the runoff of waste and slop seeping up from below, the leavings of markets and workshops and animals driven through on their way to slaughter. Live animals were regularly herded through city streets, adding their own contributions and occasional chaos to the general scene. It was less a road and more a slow, continuous event. The smell, as you have already gathered from our earlier stops, was tremendous, but the practical danger mattered too. All that filth was a highway for disease, and the streets were essentially a shared surface where the waste of thousands mingled freely with the feet and hems and shopping of everyone else. You carried a little of the street home with you every single day, whether you liked it or not, tracked across your floor and worked into your life. Efforts to keep up were constant and mostly hopeless. Cities employed people to clear and scrape and cart away the worst of it. But the horses never stopped, and so the mess never stopped, and the whole thing was a war of attrition against an enemy that regenerated by the hour. You could clean a street in the morning, and by evening it would be exactly as it had been, as if you had accomplished absolutely nothing, because you very nearly had. So the crisp, orderly Victorian street of your imagination was, in truth, a churning river of muck patrolled by broom-wielding children hoping for pennies. It was navigable, but only just, and only with care. And if the streets were filthy, you may be relieved to head indoors for a nice meal, at least until you discover what was actually in it. Let us talk about dinner, because after those streets you deserve a nice sit-down meal, and you probably imagine Victorian food was at least honest, if a little heavy and brown. Pull up a chair, tuck in your napkin, and try very hard not to think about what you're eating, because the truth about the Victorian plate is genuinely unsettling. In the early and middle decades of the century, before food safety laws arrived with any real force, the marketplace ran on a simple and cheerful principle. If you could make a product cheaper by adding something to it, you added something to it, and you did not tell the customer. This practice, known as adulteration, was rampant, systematic, and applied to nearly everything you might put in your mouth. Your groceries were a mystery box, and the mystery was rarely a pleasant one. Bread, the very staff of life, was a favourite target. To whiten it and stretch it, bakers added alum and sometimes chalk or ground fillers, so that your daily loaf might be padded out with substances that were not food in any meaningful sense. The bread looked whiter and weighed more, which pleased the seller enormously and served the eater not at all. Every sandwich was a small act of trust in a system that did not deserve it. Milk was watered down to stretch the supply, then sometimes doctored with additives to disguise the fact that it had been watered down, occasionally including things to hide that it had also started to turn. Beer and spirits were tampered with. Spices were bulked out with cheaper powders. Tea, as we've already seen, was frequently more hedge than leaf. Pickles and other goods were sometimes brightened with copper compounds to make them a more appetizing green, because nothing says appetizing like a metal that can poison you. But the true horror, the story that ought to make you set down your fork, involves sweets. Confectioners sometimes coloured their candies with genuinely toxic compounds to achieve bright, cheerful hues and cut their sugar with cheaper substances to save money. This arrangement went catastrophically wrong on one infamous occasion, when a batch of mince meant to be cut with a harmless filler was made with arsenic instead, then sold and eaten, and it killed and sickened people who had done nothing more dangerous than buy a treat. An ordinary purchase of sweets became a mass poisoning, all because the supply chain was a chaotic free-for-all with nobody checking what went in. Think about that for a moment. You could not fully trust your bread, your milk, your tea, your beer, or your candy. The most basic act of feeding yourself was shot through with hidden risk, and the customer had almost no way to know. There were no clear labels, no reliable inspections, no easy tests. You simply bought, ate, and hoped, which by now you will recognise as the great Victorian pastime. Eventually, the scale of the scandal became impossible to ignore. Chemists and campaigners began analysing food and publishing damning reports on just how widely and dangerously it was being adulterated, and public outrage grew until, at last, laws were passed to bring some order and honesty to what people were being sold. It took time, and it took genuine effort, but the era did slowly claw its way toward a food supply you could actually trust. For a long stretch, though, the wholesome Victorian meal was a comforting fiction sitting on top of a nervous reality. It was filling, it was hearty, and it was quietly gambling with your health. And if you think eating was risky, wait until you see what they hung on the walls of the very room you ate it in. You have survived a suspicious dinner, so let us retire to the drawing room, where you can relax and admire the decor. The walls are the most gorgeous shade of vivid, jewel-bright green you've ever seen, rich and fashionable, and utterly beautiful. Do admire it, do not lick it, in fact, perhaps do not lean on it either, and try to keep a window open while you're in here. That stunning green was one of the most sought-after colours of the age, and for a long stretch of the century the way to achieve it was with arsenic. Certain popular pigments, prized for their brilliant, lasting colour, were made using arsenic compounds, and these pigments went into everything. Wallpaper above all, but also paint, fabric, artificial flowers, candles, toys, and even some of the colouring that ended up near food. If it was that particular glorious green, there was a very good chance it was quietly toxic. For a while, this seemed like a wonderful bargain. The colour was cheap to produce, gloriously vivid, and did not fade the way other dyes did. So households of every level splashed it across their walls with delight. An entire nation decorated its homes, its parlours, and its nurseries in a shade that happened to be one of the deadliest interior design choices ever made, all in the name of good taste. The trouble was that arsenic did not politely stay on the wall. In damp conditions, which Victorian homes had in abundance, the wallpaper could give off toxic fumes into the air of the room, a slow, invisible seepage that the occupants breathed night after night without the faintest idea. Flakes and dust from the paper could drift loose, and in a warm, humid nursery, where a small child spent most of its time, the effect could be quietly disastrous. There were cases of children falling mysteriously ill in beautifully decorated rooms, of families sickening for reasons no one could explain, of health that improved dramatically the moment someone stripped the lovely green paper from the walls. Some observers began to connect the dots, warning that the fashionable colour was harming people in their own homes, but the colour was so popular and so profitable that the warnings took a long time to win. People loved their green far more than they feared it. Imagine choosing a paint today because it looked fabulous, hanging it in your baby's room, and slowly discovering that the room itself was making everyone unwell. That is precisely the experience some Victorian families stumbled into, decorating with enthusiasm and poisoning themselves with impeccable style. The home, meant to be a refuge, became a gentle hazard, and the more tasteful the household, the more thoroughly it might be coated in the stuff. What makes it all the more striking is how ordinary and respectable it was. This was not some fringe danger lurking only in the slums. This was the choice of comfortable, house-proud families who wanted their rooms to look their best, reaching for the most admired colour of the day, and unknowingly bringing poison into the heart of the home. Danger did not always arrive through the front door in Victorian England. Sometimes it was pasted neatly onto the walls and complimented by every visitor who came to tea. Eventually, as the evidence mounted and public awareness grew, arsenic pigments fell out of favour, manufacturers moved towards safer alternatives, and the deadly green faded from fashion. But for decades it hung in countless homes, admired, dusted and breathed, a beautiful, silent threat that everyone thought was simply good decorating. So no, that wallpaper was not just lovely decor. It was a slow chemistry experiment with a delightful colour scheme. And speaking of things that were not shared out fairly, let's talk about all that famous imperial wealth and where it actually went. The empire was vast, the wealth was legendary, the maps were splashed with colour from one edge of the world to the other, and so you naturally assume the average Victorian was doing rather nicely out of the whole arrangement. Let us take that assumption for a walk through an actual city and watch it quietly fall apart. The riches of empire were real, enormous and world-changing, and they were also concentrated in the hands of a fairly narrow band of people at the very top. The industrialists, the financiers, the landowners, and the merchants who sat at the controls of all that global trade. For them, the era truly was golden, a time of grand houses, servants by the dozen, and fortunes that beggared belief. That glittering world existed, and it is the world our postcards remember. But it was a thin layer on top of a very deep cake. Below it lived the vast majority of the population, and their experience of the greatest empire on earth was mostly hard work, tight budgets, and constant insecurity. For every gentleman comfortably counting his investments, there were countless families crammed into a single rented room, labouring long hours for wages that barely stretched to cover the rent and the bread, one illness or one lost job away from genuine catastrophe. The truly remarkable part is how close together these worlds sat. This was not a case of the rich living in one distant country and the poor in another. Grand mansions and desperate slums existed in the very same cities, sometimes within a short walk of one another, the two extremes separated by little more than a street or a wall. A person could pass in a few minutes from a district of astonishing luxury into a warren of overcrowded misery, and back again, the whole staggering inequality of the age laid out along a single route. In these poorer districts, families packed into housing that was damp, dark, and dangerously overcrowded, sharing water and sanitation between far too many people, working themselves ragged with nothing to show for it but survival. Whole neighbourhoods lived on the edge, and when times turned bad they fell straight off it, into hunger, into the dreaded workhouse, into an early grave. The empire's glory bought them nothing. The wealth flowed over their heads and out to sea, and yet the poor were often blamed for their own poverty, judged as lazy or feckless by comfortable people who had never worked a factory shift in their lives. It was easier to imagine that hardship was a personal failing than to admit that an economy of unimaginable riches was leaving most of its own people behind. The wealth was there. It simply was not shared, and the story told about those who missed out was that they somehow deserved to. Think of it like standing outside the most spectacular banquet ever thrown, the tables groaning with food, the guests dripping with jewels, and being told that the reason you're hungry in the street outside is a flaw in your character. That was the daily arithmetic for a great many Victorians, living in the shadow of wealth they helped create and would never touch. So the notion that empire made everyone rich is perhaps the most quietly misleading lie of them all. It made some people rich beyond measure, and it made many more people the fuel that fed those fortunes. The postcard shows the mansion. It simply crops out the street behind it. And speaking of things that were laced far tighter than they needed to be, let us finally address one of the most enduring myths of all, the one cinched snugly around the Victorian woman's waist. You have heard the stories. Women laced so tightly they fainted at the slightest excitement, ribs surgically removed for a smaller waist, Internal organs crushed and rearranged into new and creative positions, all in the name of an impossibly tiny middle. It makes for excellent drama, and it turns up in film after film, and most of it is wildly, gloriously exaggerated. Let us start with what a corset actually was, because the word has been dragged through so much myth that people forget its ordinary job. For the vast majority of women, a corset was simply a supportive undergarment, the practical foundation you put on in the morning, the way you might reach for supportive clothing today. It gave shape to the outfit, supported the back, and held everything in a comfortable, expected line. Working women wore them while doing hard physical labour. Farmers' wives wore them. Servants scrubbing floors wore them. You do not scrub floors all day in a garment that leaves you gasping and unconscious. The image of the swooning, breathless heroine, one hand to her forehead as she collapses onto a fainting couch, is largely a creature of fiction and gossip rather than daily fact. Yes, tight-lacing existed, the practice of cinching the waist down to a dramatic degree, and some fashionable women did it for special occasions or to chase an extreme silhouette. But it was a minority pursuit, taken to alarming lengths by relatively few, and even then usually not to the cartoonish point the stories suggest. The everyday corset of the everyday woman was a tool, not a torture device. As for the rib removal, that beloved and gruesome claim, there is essentially no credible evidence it was a real trend. Consider the era's surgery, which we have already discussed at length. This was a time when an ordinary operation could easily kill you through infection alone, when anaesthesia was new and imperfect, and when going under the knife was a genuine gamble with your life. The notion that fashionable women were casually having ribs cut out to look slimmer and surviving it in numbers does not survive even a moment of thought. It is a ghost story dressed in a ball gown. So where does the myth come from? Partly from those genuine extremes, exaggerated and repeated until the exception became the imagined rule. Partly from the way later generations love to look back and picture the Victorians as absurd and oppressed, and a fainting woman in a crushing corset made a wonderfully vivid symbol, and partly from the corset's real discomforts, because an ill-fitting or overly tight one certainly could pinch, restrict, and make a hot, crowded room genuinely unpleasant. That last point deserves fairness. Corsets were not always comfortable. Fashion did place real pressure on women to conform to a particular shape, and the tightest lacing could indeed cause difficulty breathing and other genuine problems. The critique of restrictive fashion is not wrong. It is just that the popular version has inflated a real issue into a lurid fantasy of daily fainting and surgical butchery. Think of it like the modern habit of squeezing into shapewear or shoes that look magnificent and feel like a slow negotiation with your own feet. Uncomfortable in the extreme cases, entirely normal in the ordinary ones, and hardly a conspiracy to keep anyone unconscious. The Victorian woman got dressed, got laced, and got on with a long and physically demanding day. So no, women were not spending their lives one deep breath from collapse. The corset has simply been laced far tighter in our imagination than it ever was in life. And speaking of things the Victorians took far more casually than you would ever expect, let us open the family medicine cabinet. The Victorians loved to present themselves as sober, disciplined, and self-controlled, so it may genuinely surprise you to learn that they were, quietly and completely legally, absolutely awash in narcotics. Open the average family cupboard, and you would find substances that would today require a prescription, a lecture, and possibly a police report, sitting cheerfully between the sugar and the tea. Opium was the great workhorse of the age, freely available and used for very nearly everything. Its most famous form was laudanum, a tincture of opium in alcohol, sold cheaply at any chemist and kept in countless homes as an all-purpose remedy. Got a cough? Laudanum. Trouble sleeping? Laudanum. Aches, nerves, cramps, a case of the general Mondays? Laudanum. Taken by the spoonful, no questions asked and no prescription required. It was the aspirin, the sleeping pill, and the stiff drink of Victorian life, all in one dark little bottle, and it was not only opium. As the century wore on, morphine and cocaine found their way into tonics, lozenges, and cures of every description, marketed with total confidence for coughs, toothaches, low spirits, and fatigue. Respectable people took these things routinely. Poets and writers were famously fond of them. Housewives dosed themselves for their nerves. Gentlemen soothed their various complaints. The line between medicine and recreation was blurry to the point of invisibility, because the very same bottle served both purposes, and nobody thought to separate them. Now, the most genuinely disturbing part, so brace yourself. Among the most popular remedies of the age were soothing syrups given to babies and small children to quiet them, and a great many of these were essentially opium in a friendly, comforting package. A fussy, teething, crying infant could be dosed into peaceful silence with a spoonful of something that was, in plain terms, a narcotic. It worked, in the sense that the baby stopped crying. It worked sometimes a great deal more permanently than any parent intended, because a substance strong enough to sedate an adult is a very dangerous thing to give to someone tiny. Exhausted parents, overworked nurses, and desperate families used these syrups widely, trusting the cheerful labels and the reassuring names, with little idea of what they were really administering or how much was too much. It is one of the quietest tragedies of the era, a whole culture calmly sedating its children with the best of intentions and the worst of information. How was all this possible? Because for most of the century there was little regulation of what could be sold, to whom, and in what quantity. These substances were legal, cheap, and everywhere, sold by chemists and shops and travelling sellers alike, wrapped in the same confident promises as every other cure. Nobody was checking, nobody was warning. You simply bought your opium the way you bought your flour, and carried it home in the same basket. Attitudes and understanding did shift over time, as the dangers of addiction and overdose became hard to ignore, and slow steps toward control began. But for long stretches of the Victorian age, a nation that prided itself on restraint was in fact gently and pervasively medicated, from the poet at his desk to the baby in its cradle. So the image of the clean-living, drug-free Victorian is one of the finest lies in the whole collection. They did not abstain. They simply did it legally, respectably, and often without realizing there was anything to abstain from. They wagged a stern finger at moral weakness while half the household drifted along on opium. And speaking of stern figures who are not at all what you think, let us finally meet the Queen herself. The image is fixed in your mind, and it is a powerful one. A small, round, dour woman swathed in permanent black, glaring out from every portrait, radiating disapproval, and famously declaring that she was not amused. It is a marvellous impression, endlessly quoted and imitated. It is also, like so much else tonight, mostly wrong. Start with that famous line, the one everyone knows. There is genuine doubt that she ever actually said it, or if she did, that she meant it the way the story implies. It has become a kind of shorthand for a personality she did not really have. A single frozen frown standing in for a long and surprisingly passionate life. The real woman behind the statue was far more interesting than the grumpy caricature, and far more fun. For a start, she was madly, almost scandalously in love. Her devotion to her husband, Prince Albert, was intense, emotional, and openly expressed, to a degree that startled her own advisers and courtiers. She adored him, relied on him, and delighted in him, and she was not shy about it. This was not a cold, buttoned-up marriage of duty. It was a genuine love affair conducted at the very top of a society that officially preferred its feelings kept firmly under wraps. She was also, by many accounts, someone who laughed easily and heartily, who enjoyed a good joke, who held strong opinions and a temper to match, and who threw herself into her passions with real energy. She loved music and dancing in her younger years. She loved the Scottish Highlands, where she and Albert built a happy retreat and where she felt freer than in the stiff formality of court. She sketched and painted. She wrote constantly, filling journals with vivid, candid observations. This is not the diary of a humorless woman. It is the record of someone thoroughly alive. So where does the gloom come from? From genuine, crushing grief. When Albert died, relatively young, Victoria was shattered in a way that reshaped the rest of her long life. She withdrew from public view, wore mourning for decades, and sank into a sorrow so deep and prolonged that it worried the nation and drew real criticism. The black dress that defines her image was not the uniform of a naturally stern soul. It was the outward sign of a heartbreak she never fully recovered from. And here is the crucial point about the timeline. That mournful, withdrawn figure belongs mostly to the second half of her reign. For the first half, she was a young, lively, opinionated queen, newly crowned, newly married, throwing herself into life and love with obvious relish. She was a passionate young woman for far longer than she was a grieving widow, but history, ever fond of a striking image, chose to remember the widow and quietly forgot the girl. Think of how unfair it would be to sum up any long life by only its saddest chapter. To take a person who laughed and loved and argued and lived for decades and reduce them to a single photograph taken on their worst day. That is more or less what happened to Victoria. The frown became the whole story, and the woman disappeared behind it. None of this makes her a saint or hides her flaws, of which she had plenty. It simply means the stern, joyless caricature is a lie, or at best a half-truth stretched across a much richer life. She was passionate, funny, stubborn, heartbroken, and thoroughly human. She was, in short, amused rather often. And speaking of things the Victorians have been unfairly accused of, let us address their supposedly morbid obsession with photographing the dead. You may have seen the stories drifting across the internet, the ones that insist the Victorians were so fixated on death that they routinely photographed their corpses posed as if alive. Dead relatives propped upright on hidden metal stands, their eyes painted open, arranged in cheerful family portraits as though nothing at all were wrong. It is a genuinely unsettling idea, and it is spread far and wide because it is so wonderfully creepy. It is also, in most of its lurid details, simply not true. Let us separate the real thing from the ghost story. Post-mortem photography did exist, and it was real. In an age when photography was new, expensive and rare, and when death, especially the death of young children, was a constant and heartbreaking presence. Some grieving families chose to have a final photograph taken of a loved one who had died. Very often, this was an infant or a small child, laid out as if peacefully asleep, dressed with care and surrounded by flowers. For a family that might have no other image of that child at all, it was a precious, tender keepsake, a way to hold on to a face they were about to lose forever. That is the truth of it, and it is far more moving than macabre. It was not an obsession, it was not a craze, it was a rare and deeply personal act of grief, undertaken by people who loved someone and wanted one last picture in a world where pictures were hard to come by. Now for the myths, because this is where the internet gets carried away. The dramatic tales of corpses propped upright on stands, posed standing among the living, staring out with painted eyes, are largely a misunderstanding. Those metal stands you may have heard about were real, but they were used on living subjects to help them hold perfectly still during the long exposure times that early photography demanded. Holding a pose for many seconds without moving is genuinely difficult, so a discreet brace helped keep a living, breathing, slightly bored person steady enough for a clear image. The stand supported the living, not the dead, so a great many photographs that get passed around as haunting images of standing corpses are, in fact, just ordinary pictures of very still, very serious living people who look stiff and solemn because they were told not to move, and because smiling for photographs was not yet the fashion. The unsmiling Victorian face was not a sign of death. It was a sign of a slow camera and a formal culture. Add 100 years and a spooky caption, and a bored uncle becomes a reanimated ghost. The confusion is understandable. Old photographs are strange to modern eyes. The poses are stiff, the expressions are grave, and the whole aesthetic feels distant and eerie. It is easy to look at a solemn, motionless figure and imagine the worst. But the imagination is doing most of the work, filling in a gruesome story where the reality is usually just a formal portrait of someone perfectly alive. The Victorians did have an elaborate and serious relationship with death and mourning, which we will get to, and that part is genuinely striking. But the specific claim that they were merrily photographing propped-up corpses by the thousand is a modern invention, a case of a real, gentle practice being twisted into something far darker than it ever was. So they grieved deeply and photographed rarely, and the standing dead are thankfully mostly a story we tell ourselves. And speaking of things that were genuinely dangerous rather than merely spooky, let us return to the surgeon's table and see how much your doctor really knew. Let us return to the doctor, because you may still be clinging to the hope that if the tonics were dodgy, at least the surgeons were competent and clean. Settle onto the operating table, and let me relieve you of that hope as gently as the era relieved patients of their limbs, which is to say, very quickly and with a great deal of screaming. For much of the century, the connection between filth and infection was poorly understood and worse, actively resisted. A surgeon might move directly from one patient to the next without washing his hands, carrying who knows what along with him. He might operate in a coat stiff and dark with the dried evidence of previous operations, and rather than being ashamed of it, he might regard that crust as a badge of experience, proof that here was a busy, seasoned man of medicine. The dirtier the coat, the more impressive the surgeon. This is the exact opposite of everything we now know, delivered with total confidence. The idea that invisible germs might be carried on unwashed hands and dirty instruments, and that this might be why so many patients survived the operation only to die of a raging infection days later, was slow to be accepted. The people who suggested it were often doubted, dismissed or ignored, sometimes for years, while the deaths quietly continued. It took time, evidence and persistence before the practice of proper cleanliness, sterile instruments and antiseptic methods finally took hold and began saving enormous numbers of lives. Until that shift arrived, the hospital could be a genuinely dangerous place, where infections spread from patient to patient and a stay might do you more harm than the illness that brought you in. Surviving the surgery was only the first hurdle. Surviving the days afterward, as your body fought whatever the operation had introduced, was the real test, and many did not pass it. And because there was little to dull the pain in the earlier part of the era, before anaesthesia became common, speed was everything. A fast surgeon was a celebrated surgeon, because the quicker the operation, the less time the patient spent in unspeakable agony. The most famous of these fast operators could remove a limb in a matter of moments, working at a blistering pace to a watching, wincing crowd, because surgery was often something of a public performance. Speed saved suffering, yes, but a blade moving that fast in a room that understood nothing of germs was its own kind of hazard. Picture the scene. No reliable pain relief in the early days, no understanding of infection, instruments that had not been cleaned, a surgeon in a filthy coat racing against the patient's endurance in front of an audience. It is closer to a horror show than to anything you would recognise as modern medicine, and yet it was the genuine best available, delivered by respected men doing what they sincerely believed was right. To be fair, once more, this was also the century in which all of that began to change, and change dramatically. Anaesthesia arrived and transformed surgery from a race against agony into something survivable and calm. Antiseptic methods slashed the death rate. The germ theory of disease, once doubted, became the foundation of everything. By the end of the era, medicine had been transformed almost beyond recognition. But the road there was long, and for a great many patients, it arrived too late. So the competent, clean, all-knowing Victorian doctor is, for much of the period, a comforting fiction. Surviving your physician was a genuine accomplishment, and if you managed to keep all your limbs, you still had your teeth to worry about, so let us take a look inside the Victorian mouth. Smile in Victorian England and let us take a good look inside, because you have imagined rows of neat, healthy teeth gleaming beneath all those top hats and bonnets, open wide. What we find instead is a landscape of decay, gaps, and quiet, constant pain, because the Victorian mouth was fighting a war it was mostly losing. The trouble began, as so much trouble does, with sugar. Sugar became more widely available and more heavily consumed across the century, and a population developing a serious sweet tooth met a population with almost no idea how to care for its teeth. Toothbrushing was not the daily ritual it is today. Dental care was rudimentary at best, and the result was rot on a grand scale. Cavities were rampant, toothaches were a fact of life, and a mouthful of aching, blackening teeth was closer to the norm than the exception. When a tooth became too painful or too far gone, the solution was rarely a careful repair. It was removal. Pulling teeth was the standard answer to serious dental trouble, and in the earlier part of the era, before reliable pain relief, that meant having a tooth wrenched out of your head while fully awake, gripping the chair and questioning your life choices. It was quick, it was brutal, and it was often the only option on offer. Once enough teeth had been pulled, and for many people that was a great many, you were left with the gaps, and this is where the story takes its genuinely ghoulish turn. False teeth were in demand, and the finest, most natural-looking dentures were made not from porcelain or ivory, but from real human teeth, set into a base and fitted into the mouth of a paying customer. Real teeth from real people who no longer had any use for them. And where did those teeth come from? From the dead. Teeth were harvested from corpses, from graves, and most infamously from the bodies of soldiers killed on distant battlefields, gathered up in large numbers after the fighting, and shipped off to be turned into dentures. There was a whole grim trade in it, and some of the most sought-after teeth were prized precisely because they came from young, healthy men cut down in their prime. You could, quite literally, chew your Sunday dinner using the teeth of a stranger who had died in a war. Sit with that for a moment. A respectable Victorian dressed in their finest, smiling politely at a dinner party, might be doing so with a mouthful of teeth pulled from the fallen. The polished smile you imagined, the very picture of health and prosperity, could easily be borrowed from the dead and aching in ways its owner had simply learned to endure. For those who kept their own teeth, life was not much more comfortable, because the toothache was a near-permanent companion, a background hum of pain that people carried through their days with grim familiarity. There was little to be done about it beyond endurance, extraction, and the occasional dubious remedy, so a great deal of quiet suffering went on behind all those closed lips. Dentistry did advance as the century went on, with better techniques, better materials, and eventually proper anaesthesia making the whole business far less horrific. The profession slowly became something recognisable and genuinely helpful. But for long stretches of the era, the Victorian relationship with teeth was one of decay, dread, and dead men's dentures, so the bright Victorian smile was frequently rotting, missing, borrowed, or best kept firmly closed in company. And speaking of things best kept out of sight, let us consider what happened to those who had nothing left at all, and where society chose to send them. When the poorest Victorians ran out of options, when the work dried up, the money vanished, and there was nothing left to sell or pawn, there was, in theory, one last place to catch them before they starved. That place was the workhouse, and it was designed, quite deliberately, to be as miserable as the law would allow. This was not an accident or an oversight. It was the whole point. The thinking behind the system was that relief should be made so unpleasant, so grim and shameful, that only the truly desperate would ever accept it. If the workhouse were comfortable, the reasoning went, people might actually want to go there, and that would never do. So misery was built into the design, on purpose, as a feature rather than a flaw. The safety net was woven out of dread. The first blow came at the door, where families were split apart. Husbands were separated from wives, parents from children, and the household that arrived together as a family was broken up into categories and sent to different quarters, often with little chance to see one another. A mother could be housed apart from her own young children within the same grim building. The bonds that might have offered comfort in a hard time were severed as a matter of policy, adding heartbreak to hardship. Inside, life was a monotonous grind of dull, punishing labour performed in exchange for thin food and thinner comfort. Inmates picked apart old rope into fibres, broke stones, ground bones, and toiled at other tedious, exhausting tasks that existed as much to occupy and humble them as to produce anything useful. The food was deliberately plain and sparse, enough to keep a body going and not one bit more, served within a regime of rules, silence, and unyielding routine. Every part of the day was arranged to remind you exactly how far you had fallen. And that shame was the true currency of the place. To enter the workhouse was to be marked as a failure in the eyes of a society that liked to believe poverty was a personal fault rather than a matter of bad luck, low wages, or a cruel economy. People dreaded it, feared it, and did almost anything to avoid it, because going in meant surrendering your freedom, your family, and your dignity all at once. It hung over the lives of the poor like a threat, the ever-present bottom of a very long fall. Think of it as the opposite of everything a safety net should be. A real safety net catches you gently and helps you back up. This one caught you, stripped you, separated you from the people you loved, put you to pointless labour, fed you as little as possible, and made sure you felt the disgrace of it every single day. It was help delivered as punishment, charity designed to wound. There were, of course, individual acts of decency within these places, staff who tried, moments of kindness, and reforms over time that softened some of the worst edges. And the system did keep some people from outright starvation, which is not nothing. But the guiding philosophy remained harsh by design, and for those who passed through its doors, the experience was rarely anything but bleak and degrading. So when you picture kindly Victorian charity, the warm-hearted helping of the less fortunate, remember the workhouse and how it actually worked. The net was real, but it was built to hurt, and falling into it broke families apart. And speaking of the gap between how the Victorians liked to appear and how they truly behaved, let us examine their much advertised morality. The Victorians are famous for their morality, their strict rules, their earnest sermons, the endless public talk of virtue, decency, and respectability. If there is one thing the era is remembered for, it is a kind of buttoned-up, finger-wagging seriousness about right and wrong. What it is far less famous for is how spectacularly, comprehensively and enthusiastically it failed to live up to any of it. Beneath the polished manners and the pious speeches ran an enormous underworld of vice, and nowhere is the gap between the sermon and the reality clearer than in the sheer scale of prostitution. In the great cities, and in London above all, the trade was so widespread that it operated almost as an industry, employing vast numbers of women and quietly serviced by a great many of the very men who spent their respectable hours preaching restraint. The society that lectured most loudly about purity was, behind its own curtains, one of the busiest markets for exactly the opposite. And running through all of it was a glaring double standard, cruel and unmistakable. A woman who strayed, or who was merely believed to have strayed, could be ruined utterly, cast out, disgraced, her whole future destroyed, judged without mercy by the guardians of public virtue. A man who did precisely the same things, and often far worse, could carry on with his reputation entirely intact, his indiscretions winked at, forgiven or simply ignored. Virtue was demanded fiercely of women, and requested only faintly of men, and everybody quietly understood the arrangement. This is the great open secret of Victorian morality. Respectability was very often a performance, a costume worn in the parlour and in church and at the dinner table, then removed the moment the front door closed and the curtains were drawn. Gentlemen kept mistresses. Upstanding citizens visited places they would never admit to. The public face and the private life ran along two entirely separate tracks, and the whole society had silently agreed not to mention the distance between them. The genius of it, if you can call it that, was the sincerity of the performance. These were not people who openly admitted to hypocrisy and shrugged. They committed fully to the appearance of virtue, defended it earnestly, and expected it of others, all while behaving in ways that flatly contradicted it. The mask was worn with total conviction, which is precisely why it fooled everyone, including, eventually, us. Think of it as the ancestor of every public figure who thunders about family values by day and lives a rather different life by night. The Victorians did not invent hypocrisy, but they did perfect a particularly elaborate, well-dressed version of it, wrapping private appetite in an unbroken surface of public righteousness. The sermon was real. The sin was also real. They simply happened in different rooms. None of this means the Victorians were uniquely wicked. Every age has its gap between ideals and behaviour, and there were plenty of genuinely good, sincere, upright people doing their honest best. But the specific idea that this was an era of unusual, deep-rooted moral purity, that people back then simply were more virtuous than we are, does not survive contact with the evidence. They were about as flawed as anyone, only far better dressed and far more committed to the cover story. So Victorian morality was less a way of life than a way of appearing, a magnificent facade with a very active back door. The virtue was for show, and the show was superb. And speaking of appearances hiding a much messier truth, let us leave the drawing room entirely and see where most people actually lived. Close your eyes and you can see it. A charming little house with a garden gate, roses round the door, smoke curling gently from a cosy chimney, everything neat and snug and warmly lit within. It is the picture on the biscuit tin, the England of the imagination. Now open your eyes to the slums, because that is where a great many Victorians actually lived, and the biscuit tin left them out on purpose. As the city swelled with people pouring in to work the factories and fill the endless jobs of a booming economy, housing simply could not keep pace, and the result was overcrowding on a staggering scale. In the poorest districts, families were packed into cramped, crumbling buildings, sometimes an entire family crammed into a single rented room, sleeping, cooking, washing, and living their whole lives in one small space. Privacy was non-existent. Space was a luxury nobody could afford. These were not tidy cottages. They were dense warrens of narrow courts, dark alleys, and back-to-back houses jammed together so tightly that light and air struggled to reach the ground. Some of the worst districts, the tangled rookeries, became bywords for misery, packed with far more people than the buildings were ever meant to hold. You did not have a garden gate. You had a shared passage, a communal yard, and neighbours on every side of every wall. Sanitation, as you can imagine after everything we have covered tonight, was catastrophic. A single privy might be shared among many families, dozens of people relying on one foul facility, with waste accumulating and seeping into the surroundings. Clean water was scarce and often shared from a single source among the whole crowd. In conditions like these, disease did not so much spread as detonate, tearing through packed neighbourhoods with terrible speed, because everything that could carry sickness was shared, close, and impossible to escape. The damp was relentless. The buildings were often poorly built and poorly maintained, and the whole environment worked against health, comfort, and dignity at every turn. This was home for enormous numbers of people, not a rare misfortune at the very bottom, but the ordinary experience of the urban working poor, the ones whose labour kept the entire glittering machine running. And here again is the striking part, the thing worth remembering. These slums often sat within easy reach of real wealth and comfort, in the same cities, sometimes just around the corner from fine streets and grand houses. The tidy cottage and the elegant townhouse were real, but they existed alongside this overcrowded misery, not instead of it. The England of the biscuit tin and the England of the rookery were the same England, standing side by side. Reformers, writers, and campaigners did eventually shine a harsh light on these conditions, documenting the overcrowding and squalor and pushing for change, and over time improvements in housing and sanitation did come, slowly and unevenly. The worst horrors were gradually addressed, though it took decades, and there was a great deal of suffering along the way. Progress was real, but it was late, and it was hard won. So the cosy, rose-covered Victorian cottage was a genuine thing for some, and a comforting fantasy for many more. For a vast slice of the population, home was a single crowded room in a damp, dark, disease-ridden building, shared with far too many others, and dignified by the label of housing only just. And speaking of things that were quietly overflowing, let us follow all that waste to where it ended up, and discover the day the smell reached Parliament itself. You would think that a civilization this proud, this powerful, this pleased with its own progress, would have long since sorted out something as basic as where its waste went. For a shockingly long time, the answer was simple, and it was horrifying. The waste went into the river, and everyone downstream could deal with it. The great cities produced an unimaginable volume of sewage, and much of it flowed, one way or another, straight into the waterways that ran through them. In London, that meant the Thames, the very heart of the city, became an enormous open sewer, carrying the filth of millions along its length. The same river that boats travelled, that ran past the grandest buildings in the land, that some people still drew water from, was thick with the waste of the entire population. It was a slow-moving disaster in plain sight, and for years it was simply tolerated as the way things were. The consequences were not merely unpleasant, they were deadly. Contaminated water spread disease with terrible efficiency, and outbreaks of cholera swept through the city, killing in great numbers. For a long time the true cause was misunderstood, blamed on bad air and foul smells rather than the tainted water itself, which meant the real problem went unaddressed while people died. The connection between the filthy water and the sickness was there all along, waiting to be properly understood, and until it was, the river kept on killing. Then came the summer that finally forced the issue in 1858, when a spell of hot weather turned the already foul Thames into something genuinely unbearable. The heat cooked the river and its contents into a stench so overpowering, so thick and inescapable, that it earned itself a grand and fitting name, the Great Stink. The smell rolled off the water and swamped the city, and crucially it swamped the Houses of Parliament, which sat right on the riverbank. And here is the deliciously human part of the story. This problem had existed for years, harming the poor and the powerless, and the response had been sluggish at best. But the moment the smell became so bad that the powerful men in Parliament could not breathe at their own desks, could not sit in their own chamber without gagging, could not escape it in the very seat of government, suddenly, urgently, something had to be done. Nothing motivates action quite like a personal inconvenience to the people in charge. So, at last, the will and the money were found to build a proper solution, and a vast, ambitious network of sewers was constructed to carry the city's waste away from its heart and out where it could do less harm. It was a genuinely monumental feat of engineering, one of the great achievements of the age, a system so well built that much of it served the city for generations and stands as a real triumph for Victorian ingenuity. When they finally decided to act, they acted magnificently. But it is worth remembering how they got there. The Victorians did eventually solve their sewage crisis, and they solved it brilliantly, but only after ignoring it for as long as it mainly troubled the poor, and only after the stench grew so intolerable that it offended the noses of the men who could actually fix it. It is possibly the most human thing about the entire era, and that is saying something. So, no, sewage was very much everybody's problem, floating right through the middle of the greatest city on earth. It just took a heatwave and a gagging parliament to admit it. And speaking of things the Victorians are given rather too much credit for, let us gather round the tree and talk about who really invented Christmas. It is often said, with great confidence, that the Victorians invented Christmas, that they conjured the entire cosy tradition of trees and cards and feasts and goodwill out of thin air, handing the modern world its favourite holiday fully formed. Gather round the fire, because the truth is a little humbler and a good deal more interesting than that. Christmas, of course, was already very old by the time the Victorians got their hands on it. People had been celebrating midwinter for centuries upon centuries, feasting against the darkness, decking their homes with greenery like holly and ivy, singing songs, and marking the season with warmth and excess long before Queen Victoria was ever born. The core of the thing, the gathering, the eating, the light in the dark, was ancient. The Victorians did not light that fire. They walked into a room where it was already burning. What they did do, and did brilliantly, was take all these older scattered customs and package them into the warm, family-centred, thoroughly sentimental holiday we would recognise today. They gave Christmas a fresh coat of feeling, wrapped it in domestic coziness, and, being Victorians, added a healthy dose of enthusiastic spending. They were less the inventors and more the marketing department, and what a marketing department they were. Take the Christmas tree, one of the season's great symbols. The custom of bringing an evergreen indoors and decorating it came from older traditions on the continent, particularly German ones, and it was already known in Britain before it became a craze. What truly popularised it was the royal family embracing it and being seen to do so, an image of a happy household gathered around a decorated tree that ordinary families across the country were delighted to copy. Nothing sells a trend like the fashionable set doing it first, and the fashionable set here happened to wear crowns. Then there is the Christmas card, that cheerful little rectangle you still send and receive by the pile. This one genuinely was a Victorian creation, born of the era's improving postal system and its deep love of sentiment, and it caught on with tremendous speed once it appeared. Suddenly you could mail a printed square of goodwill to everyone you knew, and everyone promptly did, and a whole tradition of obligatory seasonal correspondence was born, for which we may or may not thank them. And looming over all of it is a certain famous ghost story, a short novel about a miserly old man visited by spirits on Christmas night and transformed into a figure of warmth and generosity. That single tale did an enormous amount to shape the modern idea of Christmas as a time of family, charity, and kindness, spreading its glowing vision of the season far and wide and lodging it permanently in the culture. A story became a template, and we've been living inside it ever since. So the Victorians gathered the old feast, the greenery, the songs and the tree, added cards and sentiment and a great deal of shopping, stirred in one unforgettable ghost story, and served up the holiday in a form so appealing that we simply never let it go. They did not invent your cosy Christmas from nothing. They assembled it lovingly from parts already lying around and then sold it back to us so effectively that we credit them with the whole thing. It is honestly one of the nicer lies in the collection, a myth built out of genuine warmth. And speaking of warmth, or rather the total absence of it, let us talk about how the Victorians handled grief, because they turned sorrow into an art form. We tend to assume that grief in the past was a simple stoic business. A quiet funeral, a few tears bravely held back, and then everyone got on with life the way sensible people supposedly did. The Victorians looked at that idea, and then they built one of the most elaborate, rule-bound and downright theatrical mourning cultures the world has ever seen. For the Victorians, mourning was not a private feeling to be managed quietly. It was a public performance with a detailed script, and everyone was expected to know their lines. There were rules for how long you grieved, rules for what you wore, rules for how you behaved, and rules for how black your black was allowed to be at each stage. Getting it wrong was not merely a personal matter, it was a social misstep, noticed and judged by everyone around you. Widows had it hardest by far. A woman who lost her husband was expected to plunge into deep mourning for an extended period, often a matter of years, swathed head to toe in dull black clothing made of specific fabrics, chosen precisely because they were lightless and grim. She was to avoid society, avoid colour, and avoid anything that might suggest she was not entirely consumed by grief. Only slowly, in carefully defined stages, was she permitted to ease back toward ordinary life, allowed a little grey here, a touch of muted purple there, as if grief could be measured out and rationed by the season. There was even mourning jewellery, and here the era's love of sentiment took a genuinely striking turn. People wore dark, sombre ornaments to mark their loss, and some of these pieces were made using the actual hair of the person who had died, woven and worked into brooches, rings and lockets. A lock of a loved one's hair, transformed into something you could wear every day, kept the dead literally close to the living. It is tender and eerie in equal measure, which is a fair description of Victorian mourning as a whole. The whole culture was reinforced from the very top, because the most famous mourner in the land set the tone for everyone else. When the Queen lost her beloved husband, she withdrew into a grief so deep and so lasting that she wore mourning for the rest of her very long life. Decades of black. A nation watching its monarch refused to set aside her sorrow. If the Queen mourned like that, then mourning like that became the standard to aspire to, and an entire society took its cue from her heartbreak. There was even a thriving industry to serve all this. Shops and suppliers dedicated to providing the correct clothing, the correct fabrics, and the correct accessories for every stage of grief. You could outfit your entire sorrow properly, provided you could afford it, and keeping up appearances in mourning was yet another expense pressed upon families already reeling from loss. Grief, like so much else in the era, had been turned into something you purchased. Think of it as the opposite of the modern instinct to grieve privately and return to normal life as soon as decently possible. The Victorians grieved loudly, visibly, expensively, and for a very long time, wrapping their sorrow in strict rules and dark cloth, and wearing it where everyone could see. It was not quick, it was not simple, and it was dignified only in the most elaborate and demanding sense of the word. So mourning was a prolonged, public, rule-bound production, and putting a foot wrong was its own small scandal. And speaking of places where people were sent and rarely came back the same, let us step through the doors of the Victorian asylum. If a Victorian lost their grip on the world, if their mind faltered, or their behaviour strayed too far from what society expected, you might hope there was somewhere gentle and understanding to care for them. There was somewhere, and gentle is very much not the word. The Victorian asylum promised healing on the outside, and delivered something far closer to confinement on the inside. These institutions were often overcrowded, underfunded and grim, housing far more people than they could properly care for, and understanding far less about the mind than they confidently believed. The science of mental health was in its infancy, and what filled the gap was a mixture of guesswork, moralizing and control. People were managed rather than helped, contained rather than cured, and the difference between a hospital and a prison could be uncomfortably hard to find. Getting sent to one could be alarmingly easy, and this is the part that ought to trouble you most. The threshold for being declared unfit and locked away could be distressingly low, resting on the judgment of a small number of people and the rigid standards of a society with very fixed ideas about how one ought to behave. It was especially perilous for women, who could find themselves committed for reasons that amounted to little more than inconvenience, defiance, or a failure to fit the narrow mould expected of them. A woman who was too independent, too emotional, too difficult, or simply in someone's way could be labelled and shut away with frightening ease. Once inside, the treatments on offer range from the useless to the genuinely frightening. In the absence of real understanding, patients might be subjected to restraint, to harsh physical regimes, to cold and comfortless conditions, and to methods that had no hope of helping and every chance of harming. The goal, too often, was to subdue and manage rather than to understand and heal, and a person who entered confused and distressed might simply be made more so, and then kept there indefinitely. And indefinitely is the key word, because getting out could be far harder than getting in. Once the door had closed and the label had been applied, a person might remain confined for years, their protests taken as further proof of their condition, their sanity difficult to demonstrate to people already convinced otherwise. The very act of objecting to your imprisonment could be treated as a symptom. It was a trap with a respectable name carved over the entrance. Think of how terrifying that arrangement really is. A place that advertised care and cure, that families trusted and society endorsed, could in practice be a locked building where the vulnerable were warehoused, the inconvenient were disposed of, and the unlucky were slowly worn down by the very institution meant to mend them. The promise on the sign and the reality behind the walls were often two entirely different things. To be fair, as with so much of the era, there were reformers who fought to improve conditions, individuals who genuinely cared, and gradual changes over time that pushed toward more humane treatment. The century did see real efforts to do better, and understanding did slowly, painfully advance. But for a great many people, the asylum was not a refuge. It was a sentence. So the compassionate Victorian madhouse, the caring institution that soothed the troubled mind, was for far too many simply a locked door with a kind word painted on the outside. And speaking of people the Victorians tried very hard to keep in their place, let us finally correct the record on the supposedly powerless Victorian woman. The standard picture of the Victorian woman is a decorative, silent creature, fainting on a sofa, waiting demurely for a man's permission to exist, her whole life spent arranging flowers and looking ornamental. She was, without question, hemmed in by unfair laws and brutal expectations. But the idea that women had no power at all, that they simply sat still and let the century happen to them, is its own kind of lie, and a rather insulting one. Let us be honest about the constraints first, because they were real and severe. For much of the era, a married woman's legal identity was largely absorbed into her husband's, her property and earnings often not truly her own, her rights limited and her options narrow. Women could not vote. Many professions were closed to them. Society policed their behaviour with an unforgiving eye. The cage was real, and it was made of law, custom, and relentless expectation. None of what follows erases that. And yet, inside and around that cage, women did extraordinary things. They ran households of great complexity, which in an era of servants and large families was a genuine feat of management, and plenty ran businesses too, keeping shops, trades and enterprises going with a skill the record too often forgets. The notion that every woman was idle and dependent is simply false. A vast number worked, and worked hard, whether in the home, in service, in factories, or in trades of their own. They wrote as well, and here their power was undeniable. Women produced some of the most celebrated and enduring literature of the entire century, novels read and loved then and now, sometimes published under their own names, and sometimes under borrowed male ones, precisely to slip past the prejudice of the age. They shaped the culture with their words, told the era's stories, and outlasted many of the men who doubted them. A woman denied a vote could still command the imagination of the whole nation from behind a book. They campaigned too, and fiercely. Women organised, argued, wrote, and pushed for reform on a whole range of fronts, from the rights of women themselves to the great social questions of the day, laying the groundwork for changes that would reshape society. The long fight for the vote, for legal rights, and for a place in the professions was carried forward by determined women who refused to accept that their assigned role was the end of the matter. Progress did not simply happen to them. A great deal of it they dragged into being. And they served in ways that changed the world, most famously in nursing, where the work of pioneering women transformed the care of the sick and the wounded, and permanently altered what was thought possible. Where the door was locked, women found windows. Where they were told no, a remarkable number found a way to yes, often while pretending they were merely doing something modest and acceptable. Think of it as being told to stay in the corner and quietly moving the entire room, while everyone insisted you were only rearranging the furniture. The Victorian woman operated under enormous restriction, but restriction is not the same as helplessness, and a great many of them were anything but helpless. So no, women did not simply sit still and wait. They wrote, worked, ran, campaigned, healed, and shoved the century forward, all while being told to be decorative and quiet. And speaking of things that were a great deal rougher than the polite picture suggests, let us take a walk through the Victorian city after dark. There is a comforting fantasy of the Victorian city as a place of order and decorum, where the streets ran on good manners, and the worst villain you might meet was a charming rogue who tipped his hat before relieving you of your watch. The real streets were a good deal rougher than that, and the crime that filled them was neither rare nor especially gentlemanly. Start with the everyday hazards, the pickpockets who work the crowds with quick, practised fingers, lifting purses, watches and handkerchiefs from distracted passers-by in the crush of a busy street or market. The cities were full of them, skilled and organised, and a moment's inattention could leave you a good deal lighter than you arrived. In the poorest and most tangled districts, Whole networks of theft and trickery operated, and an unwary stranger was simply walking opportunity. There were gangs too, holding their territory and adding real menace to certain quarters of the city, and there were violent robberies that had nothing polite about them. At one point, a genuine public panic erupted over a particularly nasty style of street robbery involving a chokehold from behind, a method frightening enough that it gripped the popular imagination and had respectable citizens nervous about walking out at night. The fear was real. The newspapers fed it eagerly, and for a while the city worked itself into a proper fright over being throttled in the street. And then, of course, there is the shadow that hangs over the whole era, the unidentified killer who stalked the poorest streets of the capital and was never caught. That case seized the public imagination with a grip it has never truly released, precisely because it was so brutal, so mysterious, and so utterly at odds with the polished image the age liked to project. Beneath the top hats and the good manners moved something very dark indeed, and everyone knew it. The truth is that crime in the Victorian city was a daily reality, shaped heavily by the vast inequality we have already discussed, where great wealth and desperate poverty crowded together in the same streets. Theft and violence were never far away, driven by need, by opportunity, and by the simple pressures of packing enormous numbers of struggling people into tight, hard conditions. Desperation is a reliable engine of crime, and the era supplied desperation in abundance. The authorities responded as the century went on, with the growth of organised policing and the slow development of the systems we would recognise today for catching and prosecuting offenders. Law and order did become more structured and more professional over time, and real efforts were made to bring the chaos under control. But the sheer size of the police effort is a fair indication of how much crime there was to police, and there was a great deal. Think of it as the gap between the tourist postcard of a grand, orderly city and the actual experience of walking its streets with your hand on your pocket and one eye over your shoulder. The elegant surface was real, but so were the thieves working the crowd beneath it, and the two existed together, as everything in this era seems to. So crime was not rare, and it was certainly not gentlemanly. It was common, often violent, and woven right through the daily life of the city, however much the age preferred to look the other way. And speaking of looking the other way, let us leave the city entirely, because surely the countryside was the clean, wholesome escape everyone imagines. After all the filth, fog, and danger of the Victorian city, escaping to the wholesome countryside sounds like the obvious cure, and you probably imagine rolling green fields, contented villagers, and a simple, healthy life lived in gentle harmony with the land. It is a lovely daydream. The rural reality was often just poverty with a much nicer view. Life for the ordinary farm labourer was one of hard, grinding, physical work for painfully low pay. The days were long, dictated by the seasons and the sun, and the labour was brutal, demanding and endless, with little reward waiting at the end of it. These were not the merry, well-fed peasants of the storybook. They were poorly paid workers, often barely scraping by, whose back-breaking effort kept the countryside running while leaving them with next to nothing to show for it. Their homes were frequently cramped, damp, and poorly built, cold cottages that let in the weather and offered little comfort against it. The romantic image of the snug country dwelling, all thatched roof and warm hearth, gives way, on closer inspection, to overcrowding, damp walls, and hardship not so very different from the misery of the city, only with fewer people around to witness it. Poverty in a beautiful setting is still poverty, and the fresh air did nothing to fill an empty stomach. Hunger was a real and constant threat, because rural life was at the mercy of forces entirely beyond any labourer's control. A poor harvest, a hard winter, a change in the demands of a landlord, and a family could be tipped from just barely managing into genuine want. There was little cushion, little security, and little mercy in the arrangement. When times turned bad in the countryside, they turned very bad indeed, and there was often nowhere to turn for help. Disease found the countryside too, because poverty, poor housing, and hard living breed sickness wherever they occur, field or city alike. The idea that rural air was a magical tonic that kept country folk hale and hearty was wishful thinking. The same hardships that afflicted the urban poor, the damp, the malnutrition, the exhausting labour, took their toll on the rural poor as well, out among the pretty hills where no one thought to look. This is in fact a large part of why so many people abandoned the countryside altogether and streamed into the cities over the course of the century. They did not leave the beautiful, healthy countryside for the grim factory towns because they were foolish or restless. They left because the idyllic countryside was not feeding them, because the wages were low and the work was uncertain and the future was bleak, and because the roaring cities, for all their horrors, at least offered the promise of a job and a wage. People vote with their feet, and an enormous number of feet walked away from the fields. Think of it as discovering that the peaceful rural retreat of your imagination came with all the hardship of poverty, and none of the opportunity wrapped up in scenery so pleasant that outsiders simply assumed everyone must be perfectly content. The view was genuinely lovely. Unfortunately, you cannot eat a view, and a great many country folk went to bed hungry beneath those beautiful skies. So the countryside was no fresh air paradise for the people who actually worked it. It was hard, poor and precarious, dressed up in green. And speaking of things that looked beautiful and were quietly doing harm, let us return indoors and sit down at the dressing table. The pale, flawless, porcelain complexion you admire in old Victorian portraits, that smooth, luminous, untouched skin, came at a genuinely startling cost. Sit down at the dressing table because the era's beauty routine was less a matter of harmless vanity and more a slow, patient experiment in poisoning yourself for the sake of good looks. The great beauty ideal of the age was a fashionable paleness, a delicate, ghostly whiteness of the skin that signalled refinement and a comfortable distance from anything so vulgar as outdoor labour. To achieve it, some people turned to powders and washes designed to whiten the complexion, and the trouble was that the most effective of these contained ingredients like lead, applied directly to the face day after day in pursuit of that admired pallor. Lead makes a wonderful white. It also happens to be poison, absorbed steadily through the skin of anyone determined enough to keep using it. The results, over time, were exactly what you would expect from painting your face with a toxic metal. The very substances used to create beautiful skin could, with prolonged use, damage that skin and the health of the person beneath it, so that the pursuit of beauty slowly undermined the very thing it was chasing. Some sought an even smoother, more flawless finish through elaborate treatments that only deepened the exposure. The mirror said lovely. The body kept a rather different set of records. Then there were the complexion wafers, and this is where it becomes almost too much to believe. Products were sold promising a clear, pale, beautiful complexion, achieved not by applying something to the skin but by eating it, and some of these contained low doses of arsenic, taken deliberately and regularly in the belief that it improved the appearance. Yes, people willingly consumed small amounts of a notorious poison as a beauty regimen, trusting the cheerful promises printed on the packaging. It is a diet plan that no one should ever attempt, then or now. The eyes got their own dangerous treatment. To make the eyes appear larger, brighter, and more alluring, some women used drops derived from a plant so toxic that its very name is a warning, a plant long known for being deadly. These drops widened the pupils and gave the eyes a striking, dreamy look that was much admired, at the small cost of being drawn from one of nature's more effective poisons, and doing the eyes no favours at all over time. Beauty, once again, borrowed heavily from the poison cabinet. What ties all of this together is the sheer ordinariness of it. This was not the behaviour of a reckless few. These were fashionable, respectable people, following the beauty standards of their day, reaching for the products that promised the admired look, and unknowingly, or sometimes knowingly, paying for it with their health. The pursuit of the perfect face was, for a distressing number of people, a quiet act of self-harm dressed up as self-improvement. Think of it as the ancestor of every dangerous beauty trend that has ever promised the world and delivered damage, only with far less understanding of the risks and far deadlier ingredients close at hand. The Victorians wanted to look flawless, and they were willing to lead coat, arsenic dust and belladonna drop their way there, one lovely poisonous application at a time. So no, those cosmetics were not harmless. They were a slow chemical experiment performed on the most visible part of the body, all for the sake of a fashionable glow. And speaking of things this supposedly rational age got up to, let us turn down the lamps and hold a séance. The Victorians are celebrated, and rightly, as a rational scientific people, striding boldly into the age of reason with a microscope in one hand and a steam engine in the other, measuring, cataloguing and explaining the world as never before. And yet the very same society in the very same drawing rooms was utterly enthusiastically mad for the supernatural. Turn down the lamps, because it is time for a séance. Spiritualism, the belief that the living could communicate with the dead, swept through the era like a craze, and it was not confined to the gullible or the desperate. It became genuinely fashionable, a pastime of respectable, educated, intelligent people who gathered in darkened rooms to attempt contact with the departed. Families and friends would sit around a table, hands linked, waiting in the flickering dark for a sign from beyond, and a great many of them came away utterly convinced they had received one. At the centre of it all were the mediums, individuals who claim the power to reach the other side, and who perform their contact with the dead for eager audiences. Tables would tremble and tip. Mysterious knocks and raps would answer questions. Objects would move. Voices would whisper. Messages would be spelled out, and the assembled believers would gasp and marvel and go home, certain they had brushed against the afterlife. Some mediums became famous and wealthy on the strength of these performances, celebrities of the beyond. Now a great deal of this was trickery, and some of it was eventually exposed as exactly that, clever illusions and cold reading and sleight of hand dressed up as contact with the dead. But the striking thing is not that some people were fooled, it is who was doing the believing. This was not a fringe superstition lurking among the uneducated. It reached deep into respectable society and captured the imaginations of serious, clever, accomplished people, some of whom applied their considerable minds to investigating it in earnest, convinced there was something real to find. Why did it grip the age so powerfully? Partly because death was so ever-present, and the longing to reach lost loved ones was overwhelming in a time when families were so often broken by early death. Partly because the era's very confidence in progress made people wonder whether the spirit world might simply be the next great frontier to be explored and explained, and partly because it was, frankly, thrilling, a shiver of mystery and wonder in an age that otherwise prided itself on hard facts. Reason and enchantment, it turns out, can live quite happily in the same house. That is the real lesson here, the wonderful contradiction of it. The same century that gave us monumental scientific advances, that dragged medicine toward the light and built marvels of engineering, was also holding hands in the dark and asking a rattling table to spell out a message from beyond the grave. The rational Victorian and the credulous Victorian were frequently the very same person, marvelling at a new invention by day and summoning spirits by night. Think of it as the perfectly modern habit of trusting science completely and also quietly checking your horoscope, following the evidence and the omens at the very same time, with no apparent sense of conflict. The Victorians were not purely the cool rationalists of legend. They were dreamers and mystics too, right alongside their microscopes. So no, they did not all worship cold hard science. Plenty of them were in the parlour with the curtains drawn, listening for the dead, and speaking of faith in things that could badly let you down. Let us board the great symbol of Victorian progress and see how safe it really was. Progress was the great religion of the Victorian age, and nothing preached its gospel more loudly than the railway, thundering across the land as living proof that the future had arrived, faster and grander than anything before it. It was the marvel of the era, the shining symbol of everything the age believed about itself. What the glossy image tends to leave out is how genuinely dangerous that shining future often was. The railways were new, expanding at breakneck speed, and the technology, the rules and the safety measures were all racing to catch up with the sheer ambition of the thing. The result was that accidents happened, and when they did, they could be catastrophic. Trains crashed, bridges failed, boilers burst, signals were misread, brakes proved inadequate, and the enormous, heavy, high-speed machines that so thrilled the public could, when something went wrong, go wrong on a terrible scale. Riding the marvel of the age carried real risk, and the passengers were, in a sense, all part of one vast ongoing experiment. And it was not only the railways, the factories that powered all this glorious progress, that made the goods and the wealth and the roaring economy were staggeringly dangerous places to work. The great machines that drove industry had no interest whatsoever in the human beings who operated them, and they maimed and injured workers with grim regularity. Fingers, hands and limbs were caught, crushed and torn away by machinery that never slowed and never cared, in workplaces where safety was an afterthought and the worker was cheap and easily replaced. The pace of it all was precisely the problem. Everything was moving faster than the understanding of how to do it safely, the ambition sprinting far ahead of the caution. New machines, new speeds, new industries, and new ways of doing everything arrived in a rush, and the knowledge of how to protect the people working with them lagged badly behind. Progress charged forward, and the safeguards limped along in the rear, always a step too late for those who had already been hurt. For the injured worker, the consequences were often devastating and permanent. Lose a limb or your health to the machinery, and there was little in the way of support or compensation to catch you. You might simply be discarded, replaced by the next pair of hands, and left to fend for yourself in a society that had extracted your labour and felt little obligation once you could no longer provide it. The human cost of the great industrial miracle was paid quietly, in bodies, by people the postcards never showed. Over time, as the dangers became impossible to ignore, reforms did come, with growing regulation of the railways, the factories, and the conditions of work, and gradual improvements in safety that made the machinery of progress a little less murderous. The century that built these wonders eventually began, slowly, to protect the people caught up in them. But that protection was hard won, and late in arriving, and a great many people were broken in the meantime. Think of it as the eternal bargain of rushing headlong into the future, dazzled by the speed and the spectacle, and only later counting the cost in the people who were hurt along the way. The Victorians built the modern world at a sprint, and they paid for it, quite literally in blood. So progress did not simply make life safe and comfortable, it made life faster, grander, and in many ways far more dangerous, at least until the safeguards finally caught up. And that brings us, at last, to the biggest and gentlest lie of them all. And so we arrive at the final lie, the gentlest and perhaps the most important one of all, the comfortable idea that the Victorians were a strange, distant, faintly ridiculous people, hopelessly different from us, perfectly safe to laugh at from the cosy distance of the present. It is the most reassuring myth in the whole collection. and it may be the least true. Look back over everything we have uncovered tonight, and a pattern emerges that should feel a little uncomfortably familiar. They performed respectability in public while living very differently in private, presenting a spotless face to the world and hanging up the act the moment the door closed. They preached one set of values and practiced another, and largely agreed not to mention the gap. If any of that rings a bell in your own age, well, that is rather the point. They chased beauty and status at real cost to themselves, poisoning their skin and cinching their bodies and spending money they often didn't have in order to appear a little finer than they truly were. They filled their homes with the fashionable thing even when the fashionable thing was quietly harmful, because everyone else had it, and it looked so wonderfully impressive. Swap the arsenic wallpaper for whatever we cannot resist today, and the impulse is identical. We have not stopped decorating our lives with things that are bad for us. We have simply changed the colour. They trusted things they should not have, believed confident sellers with miracle cures, swallowed whatever the label promised, and put their faith in authorities who often did not deserve it. They lived surrounded by information they could not verify, and made the best guesses they could, exactly as we do, scrolling through a world of confident claims and hoping we can tell the true from the false. Their tonics are our miracle products. Their credulity is our credulity, simply wearing older clothes. And most of all, they told themselves flattering stories about who they were. They believed their age was the very pinnacle of civilization, the cleanest, most moral, most advanced society the world had ever produced, and they were quite sure that the people of the past had been primitive and the people of the future would simply admire them. They were, in other words, exactly as certain of their own superiority as every age is, right up until the next one arrives to gently correct the record. Sound like anyone you know. The truth is that the Victorians were not aliens in top hats, and they were not a cautionary cartoon of quaint mistakes. They were people, as clever and foolish, as kind and cruel, as vain and hopeful and self-deceiving as people have always been, doing their best inside the limits of what they knew, and getting a great deal of it wrong along the way. Strip away the fashions and the fog, and what remains is startlingly recognisable. It is us, in different clothing, making very similar mistakes, which is exactly why the lies about them are so easy to believe. We want them to be different because if they were foolish and we are wise, then we are safe. But they thought precisely the same about the people who came before them, and someday someone will tuck themselves into bed and laugh softly at the funny little things we were all so sure of tonight. And with that, we reach the end of the great catalogue of Victorian lies, 30 comfortable stories quietly taken apart in the dark, one gentle myth at a time. So here we are, at the end of the journey, the great yellow fog finally beginning to lift. Tonight we peeled back the pretty postcard and found the real Victorian England underneath. We waded through streets thick with muck, breathed air that could quietly kill you, drank tea that was half hedge, and admired wallpaper that was slowly poisoning the room. We met children sent up chimneys, doctors in coats they were proud never to wash, a queen buried in decades of black, and a whole society performing spotless virtue while living something else entirely behind the curtains. And yet through all of it, people carried on. They raised families in single crowded rooms, laughed in the very shadow of the workhouse, fell in love, wrote great books, built astonishing things, and dragged their world, inch by stubborn inch, toward something better. They did not know they were living inside a myth. They simply lived, as bravely and foolishly and hopefully as anyone ever has. That is the quiet lesson beneath all the lies. The Victorians were not a fairy tale, and they were not a cautionary cartoon. They were people, doing their best with what little they had, and a great deal of the comfort wrapped around you right now exists because they endured what they endured. So tonight, as you settle into your clean, warm bed, with safe water in the tap, light at the flick of a switch, and not a single speck of arsenic on the walls, maybe spare a soft, grateful thought for them. For the ones who survived the fog, the filth, and the soothing syrup so that someday you would not have to. History is gross and strange and often ridiculous, but it is also proof that people are tougher, kinder, and far more hopeful than the darkness they pass through. Rest easy now. You have more than earned it. Good night.